My name is Eleanor Voss, and I'm 32 years old. At my own wedding, my family handed me a gift box. And when I opened it in front of 110 people, it was completely empty. My mother smiled while I stared into all that nothing. She had planned it. She wanted the whole room to watch. But the empty box wasn't the cruelest thing that happened that night. And it wasn't the thing that changed my family forever. What my grandfather slipped into my hands 20 minutes later did that. And what my mother nearly did when I opened that second box at the head table. I will carry with me until the day I die. Welcome back to Calm Drama Vault, where we sit with the quiet moments that remake a family. The ones that happen at kitchen tables and wedding halls, not courtrooms. If stories about dignity and standing your ground speak to you, drop a comment and subscribe. Let me back up because a box doesn't stay empty by accident. I work as a claims examiner at an insurance office 2 blocks from the county courthouse. I read policies for a living. I notice when a single clause is missing, and I notice when a whole person is. In my family, I was always the reliable one. When Grandpa needed a ride to the cardiologist, I drove him. When someone had to sit at the hospital all night, that someone was me. When my brother Theo forgot our mother's anniversary, I bought the gift and signed both our names. I was praised for exactly one thing my whole life. Sensible. Never smart. Never brave. Never beautiful. Sensible. The way you praise a reliable car. My mother, Diane, measured everything in numbers. I learned young that love in our house came with an invoice attached. You earned your seat at the table. You paid for it in usefulness, and the bill was never marked paid. I got very good at paying. I brought casseroles to funerals of people I barely knew. I remembered every anniversary. I answered the phone at 2 in the morning and never once asked why it was always my number they called. Somewhere along the way I made myself a quiet promise, the kind you don't say out loud. I thought if I just did enough, and did it perfectly, one day it would finally be enough. I never let myself finish that sentence. Enough for what, exactly? I didn't want to know the answer, because I already suspected the box at the bottom of it was empty. I just didn't think my mother would gift wrap it and hand it to me in front of everyone I loved. Then I met Marcus Doyle. And for the first time, nobody was holding a calculator. Marcus is a lineman. He climbs poles in ice storms so the rest of us can keep our lights on, and he has the hands to prove it. Rough and warm and steady. We met when a transformer blew on my street and half the block went dark for 2 days. He was the one still working at 11 at night when everyone else had gone home. I brought him coffee because it was cold, and he thanked me like I'd handed him something rare. We talked in the dark for an hour. He asked me questions nobody had asked me in years. Not what I did, but what I liked. Not what I was worth, but what made me laugh. When I told him I was a claims examiner, he didn't ask how much it paid. He asked if I liked the people. On our 3rd date, he fixed my neighbor's porch light and refused the $20 she tried to press into his hand. That's just how he is. He sees a broken thing and he mends it. He doesn't send a bill. The first time he looked at me, really looked, I felt something I had no name for. Then I placed it. He was looking at me like I was already enough. Not enough if, not enough when. Just enough. I had spent 30 years auditioning for my own family, and this stranger in a hard hat had cast me in the part on the first day. I loved him before I let myself say it. And I already dreaded one single moment. The moment I would have to introduce him to my mother. The engagement dinner was at a restaurant my mother chose specifically because the prices weren't on the website. There were 12 of us. My mother had made a seating chart, which should have been my first warning. She put Marcus at the very end, right beside the little folding table where Theo's daughter Nina and 2 cousins were coloring on paper placemats. The kids' table. She did it with a smile. The way she does everything cruel so that if you object, you're the one making a scene. Marcus sat down without a word and started teaching 8-year-old Nina how to draw a house that wouldn't fall down. Halfway through dinner, my mother asked him across the whole table exactly what a man in his line of work brings home in a year. She said it sweetly. She called climbing poles the squirrel job. My aunt laughed. Theo laughed a beat later. The way he always follows our mother. half a second behind and twice as loud. Marcus answered the number plainly, no shame in it, and my mother repeated it back slowly so everyone could hear how small she thought it was. I opened my mouth. Under the table, a hand found my knee and squeezed. Not Marcus's. I looked over, and my grandfather Elias, 86 years old, was quietly folding his napkin and standing up. He walked the length of the table, past the empty chair beside my mother, and sat down next to Marcus at the kids' table. He asked him about ice storms. He asked him if he was ever scared up there. The whole table went quiet. That was the first crack of light I'd seen in 30 years. And I didn't understand yet why my grandfather, of all people, had chosen his side. My mother has a habit that tells you everything about her. When she's upset, she opens the calculator app on her phone and starts tapping like she's totaling up a loss. She did it in the car after the dinner, in the passenger seat. Thumb going. Thumb going. Then she said the thing I'd been dreading since I was a child. She called my marriage a bad investment. She said it the way she'd say a stock had dropped. She reminded me our family had a name in this town, a standing, and that I was about to spend it all on a man who climbs poles. Then she looked at me sideways and said something I didn't fully understand yet. She said if I went through with it, I shouldn't expect anything to still be there for me. My part, she called it. Don't come asking about your part. I asked her what part. She just tapped the phone. I thought she meant her approval, which I'd never really had anyway. I thought she meant a spot in the will, a number I'd never counted on. I didn't know yet that my part had an address, an orchard behind it, and a set of stairs my grandfather built by hand. I didn't know my mother had already decided to sell it, and that she needed me to fall in line before she could. I just sat there in the passenger seat while my mother added me up and found me wanting. And for one ugly second, some small girl still living inside me wondered if the calculator was right. There's a house I need to tell you about. My grandfather Elias built it himself on 10 acres outside town, board by board, over the course of about 9 years. I don't know how a working man found the time. I only know that every good memory I have as a child happened inside those walls. Grandpa taught me to graft apple trees in the orchard behind it. He showed me how the stairs were joined so they'd never squeak. To this day, they don't. My grandmother died 8 years ago, and Grandpa still lives out there alone, 30 minutes past the last stoplight. I drive out most weekends because somebody should, and because I want to. 2 weeks before the wedding, I stopped by my mother's house to drop off some papers, and I heard her on the phone in the kitchen. She was using her business voice, the smooth one. She was talking to a real estate agent about the orchard property. She used the word clear it out. She said the word dated. She was selling my grandfather's house, the one place on earth that still smelled like him, like cedar shavings and cut apples and coffee. I stood in the hallway with the papers in my hand and felt the floor tilt. Then I remembered one thing and I held on to it like a railing. The house wasn't hers. It was in my grandfather's name. It always had been. My mother could want it sold all she liked, but the pen belonged to Elias. And I did not yet understand how hard my mother was already working to get it into her hand. 3 days later, my mother made her next move, and she made it in writing. She sent an email to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my father's side. Everyone. In it, she announced she was withdrawing her offer to help pay for the wedding. She'd promised to cover the venue and the dinner months ago, in front of witnesses, and now she was very publicly taking it back. She wrote that she didn't invest in ventures with poor fundamentals. She actually wrote that about her own daughter's marriage, and she copied 30 people so they'd all know it was a dare. Cancel the wedding, come crawling back, apologize for embarrassing the family, and maybe the money reappears. That was the whole point of doing it in public. She wanted me to feel the walls close in. Marcus read the email over my shoulder, set his jaw, and said one thing. We'll pay for our own wedding then. So we did. We moved it to the community hall by the fairgrounds. We did the math at the kitchen table like adults. $12,000 of our own savings, most of his. No chandelier, no plated dinner. Folding tables and string lights and a potluck of casseroles from people who actually loved us. I cried at that table, but not the way you'd think, because for the first time the wedding was ours. Nobody had bought it, which meant nobody could take it back. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched my whole life, and I didn't have a word for it yet. I would learn the words soon enough, and I would nearly trade it away for the very thing my mother was dangling. The week before the wedding, Theo let something slip. We were addressing the last of the place cards at my apartment, and my brother, who cannot hold a secret to save his life, giggled and said Mom had prepared a special gift for the reception, something for everyone to see. He said it like it was fun. I asked what it was, and he covered his mouth and said he'd promised not to tell, which meant he was dying to. All he'd add was that Mom wanted to make a point in front of everybody. I got a cold feeling in my stomach, the same one I get when a policy has a clause that reads too smooth. That night, my mother called, ostensibly about parking at the hall. Near the end, she said in that light voice she uses for her sharpest knives, "Don't worry, dear. What happens at the reception will show everyone exactly what this marriage is worth." Then she said goodnight like she'd complimented my dress. I hung up. And I knew the way you know weather is coming that she had built me a trap and wrapped it in ribbon. Here's the thing people never understand about a moment like that. I couldn't cancel. It was my wedding. You don't call off your own wedding because your mother has a surprise. You can't uninvite 100 people. You can't unbook the hall. And you can't refuse a gift in front of everyone without becoming the villain of your own story. So I did the only thing I could. I decided that whatever was in that box, I would not give her the reaction she'd paid for. I had no idea my grandfather had been preparing a box of his own for 60 years. The morning of the wedding, the community hall smelled like coffee and lily and floor wax. Marcus got there before the caterer, before the flowers, before me. When I walked in, he was up on a ladder in his undershirt, hanging the string lights himself because he didn't trust the way they'd been strung. Of course he was. The man mends things. He'd wired the whole hall so every bulb came on at once. And when he flipped the switch and the room filled with warm little lights, Nina clapped. She'd appointed herself my shadow for the day. She followed me around holding my veil off the floor so it wouldn't get dusty. Very serious about the job. My phone rang while I was buttoning my dress in the back office. It was my grandfather. His voice was low and steady. The voice he uses when something matters. He said he was coming, no matter what my mother had arranged about rides, and he'd find his own way there. Then he said something that made me stop with the button half done. "Tonight, when it happens, I want you to hold on to me. Whatever they do, you stay close to me and you wait." "Can you do that for your old grandpa?" I said yes without knowing what I was agreeing to. I asked what was going to happen. He just said, "You'll see. And Ellie, don't open anything until I tell you to." Then he hung up. And I stood there in a half-buttoned dress with my heart going. Because my grandfather had never in his life sounded like a man with a plan. The ceremony itself was the best 20 minutes of my life, right up until I looked at my mother. We kept it simple. No program, no soloist, just Marcus and me and a pastor who'd known us both since we were kids. Marcus wrote his own vows on a piece of paper folded so many times it had gone soft. He didn't say anything about forever or fairy tales. He said he'd keep my lights on. He said when the whole world went dark and cold, I'd never once wonder if he was still climbing toward me. His hands were shaking. Mine were too. Nina held the veil. The little hall was full of people who'd brought potato salad, and folding chairs in their whole hearts, and in the front row sat my mother in a dress that cost more than our catering. Her hands folded in her lap, her thumb moving. Even then, she was under the table with her calculator, tallying what this was costing her in reputation. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She totaled. Then halfway through the vows, the double doors at the back of the hall opened, and someone wheeled my grandfather in. My mother had not arranged a ride for Elias. My mother had, I later learned, specifically told the family Grandpa was too tired to come and shouldn't be bothered. Yet there he was in his good gray suit, being pushed down the aisle by a neighbor he'd called himself. He had a small box in his lap, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and he held it with both hands like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. My mother turned and saw her father. For just a second, something crossed her face that I couldn't read. It looked, of all things, like fear. At the reception, you could feel the two families in the room like oil and water refusing to mix. Marcus's people were loud and easy, hugging strangers, filling plates twice. My mother's people sat straighter, spoke softer, and kept sneaking looks at Marcus the way you'd look at a stain on a nice carpet. I heard the word sweet used about him 3 times, and every time it meant beneath us. I heard someone murmur it was a shame, a girl with her sense. I kept my chin up and my hand in Marcus's and I worked the room. The whole time, my mother sat at the center table like a queen waiting for the right moment. That wrapped box beside her plate, not Grandpa's brown paper box. A different one. Glossy white with a silver bow. Expensive looking. Exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to hold something wonderful. My grandfather had asked me to wheel him right up to the head table, next to me and Marcus. And I did, and he kept one hand on my arm the entire time. Just like he'd said he would. When the plates were cleared, my mother stood up and tapped a glass with her ring. And the room went quiet the way rooms do for her. Before the dancing, she said in her warm public voice, "I'd like to give my daughter and her new husband a little something. A family tradition. There is no such family tradition. I have been in this family my whole life." My grandfather's fingers tightened on my arm. Under the table on my other side, Marcus took my hand. My mother lifted that beautiful white box off the table and held it out to me, smiling, in front of every single person we knew. I want you to picture it. Because she certainly did. 110 faces turned toward me, string lights overhead, my grandfather's hand on my arm, my husband's hand in mine. My mother, radiant, holding out a gift I already knew was a trap. And me, with no choice in the world but to take it. So I took it. It was light, too light. A box that size, wrapped that carefully, should have weight to it. This one had none. I knew before my fingers found the lid exactly what was inside. I lifted it anyway, because 110 people were watching and my mother had bet everything on my face. Inside was nothing. White tissue paper folded around empty air. Not a card, not a coin, not a note. Just the inside of an empty box, staring back up at me. And into the silence, loud enough to carry to the very back of the hall, my mother said the words she'd been sharpening for weeks. "That's all your marriage is worth." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My aunt laughed. My cousins laughed. Theo laughed his half-second late laugh. The sound of it went through me like cold water. My mother stood there glowing, waiting for me to crumble, because the crumbling was the gift. The crumbling was the whole point. I looked down into that empty box, and I understood something I'd spent my life not looking at. She hadn't given me nothing. She'd given me a mirror. This was how she'd always seen me. Sensible, useful, and finally fully worthless. The only person in that whole loud laughing room who wasn't laughing was Nina, 8 years old, staring at her grandmother with her mouth open. And under the table on my arm, my grandfather's old hand went from resting to gripping. And I felt him lean in close. My grandfather pulled me down toward him by the arm. Gently, the way he used to when I was small and he had a secret worth telling. His mouth was right at my ear. Around us, the laughter was still dying down and my mother was still standing, still glowing, still waiting for me to give her the tears she'd ordered. I didn't. I bent down to my grandfather instead, and into my lap, hidden by the tablecloth in my own 2 hands. He pressed the little box wrapped in brown paper and string. "It's warm from my lap," he whispered, and his voice did not shake at all. "It's heavier than it looks. Don't open it here. Wait until you're back in your seat at the head table where you belong. Open it there. Slow and clear." He waited until I turned to look him in the eye. His eyes were wet and fierce and 86 years old and absolutely certain. "When you open it, you look straight at your mother. You don't look away. You understand me? You look right at Diane." I nodded. I couldn't speak. My hands closed around that brown paper box, and I felt the shape of something inside it, small and hard and round, and something folded, paper. My mother finally sat down, satisfied, thinking the show was over, thinking she'd won the night. She had no idea the night hadn't started yet. I straightened up. I set the empty white box aside without a word, which I could see confused her. Because a reaction was the whole reason she'd built it. I carried my grandfather's little box back to my seat at the head table. Under the warm lights my husband had strung with his own hands, and I sat it down in front of me. And I untied the string. The paper came away in my hands, quiet. And inside was a small wooden box my grandfather had made. I knew his work. I knew those joints. Inside, resting on a square of blue felt, were 3 things. The first was a wedding ring, a thin gold band worn almost to a wire on the underside. The way a ring goes when a man wears it every day for 60 years and never once takes it off. My grandmother's ring. The second was a small brass pin, dull and green at the edges, stamped with the seal of an electricians' and linemen's union and a number underneath. The third was a piece of paper folded in quarters, and when I opened it, I saw my grandfather's handwriting. The sharp, upright letters he learned in a one-room school 80 years ago. It was short. It said, "Everything this family has, I built with these hands." They called me nothing. I was the richest man I ever knew. Wear the ring when you forget your worth. Wear the pin when they try to set it for you. And then, at the bottom, underlined once, I have never forgotten. They said I was worth nothing. I built everything you're standing in. I read it twice. Then I did what my grandfather told me to do. I looked up and I looked straight across the reception at my mother. And Diane, who had been laughing and glowing, and accepting congratulations for her clever little joke, saw the wooden box open in my hands. She saw the brass pin catch the light, and her face went white all at once, the color dropping out of it like water out of a cracked glass. She half rose out of her chair. Her hand shot to the edge of the table. For a second, I thought she was going to stand all the way up and cross the room and take it out of my hands. She caught herself. She sank back down. But everyone at our end of the hall had seen it. My mother was afraid. And I finally understood that the empty box had never been the real gift in that room. I sat there holding a brass union pin. And 32 years of small, strange things rearranged themselves in my head all at once. My whole life, my mother had told a story about where we came from. Old family, good stock. People of a certain standing, she'd say, as if standing were something you inherited, like a nose. But nobody ever said what my grandfather actually did. I'd never once heard the word for his job spoken in her house. When I was little, there had been a photograph on the hallway wall. A man in work clothes with his sleeves rolled up, grinning next to a coil of cable, one boot on a transformer box. One day it was gone. When I asked, my mother said it had been the wrong photograph for that wall. I was 7. I didn't push. Now I was holding the seal of a union in my hand, green with age, worn smooth by a thumb that must have rubbed it 1,000 times. I understood that the man in the vanished photograph and the man who built the squeakless stairs were the same man, and that my mother had spent my entire childhood quietly erasing him. All that standing she was so proud of, all that name, the reputation she was willing to sacrifice me to protect, it had been built by a lineman. By exactly the kind of man she'd just seated at the children's table. By exactly the kind of man she'd just told 100 people my marriage was worthless for choosing. I looked up from the pin, and across the room, my mother was already moving. She'd stood, smoothed her dress, fixed her smile back into place, and she was walking straight toward the head table. Toward me, toward the little wooden box with the brisk, purposeful step of a woman coming to clean up a spill before it stains. She reached me with her party smile on, and her eyes like winter. She leaned down close and murmured that we should step out for a moment. And to anyone watching, it looked like a mother pulling her daughter aside for a happy word. I went, because I didn't want this in front of Nina. And because I wanted to hear what she'd say when she thought no one was listening. In the hallway by the coat racks, she dropped the smile like a coat of her own. "Put that box away," she said, low, fast. "This is neither the time nor the place." I asked her what she was so afraid of. I heard my mother's own sentence walking around in my head. "That's all your marriage is worth. And for the first time in my life, it sounded exactly as empty as the box she'd handed me. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she pivoted the way she always does, to money and to duty. She told me my grandfather was confused, that he wasn't well, that he gets ideas. She told me that house on the orchard land was falling apart and needed to be sold before Elias did something foolish with it. She said it fast and smooth, and I felt the shape of the thing under the words, the clause too clean. The real reason for all of it. My mother didn't just want that house sold. She needed my grandfather to sign it over to her. And soon. Before anyone could ask him what he actually wanted. And she needed me quiet and grateful and back in my place while she did it. I looked at my mother in that hallway, and I stopped being afraid of her. It was the strangest feeling, like setting down a bag I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was heavy. Let me step out of the story for 1 second. Because I think some of you are sitting exactly where I was sitting. If your worth has ever been decided by people holding a checkbook, hear me say this. You are not the one who's poor in that room. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and stay with me. Because the morning after my wedding is when everything really turned. Back in the hall, I went and danced with my husband and did not let my mother steal one more minute of it. But my mind was working the whole time, the way it works over a bad claim file, looking for the misrepresentation and the way out. I read documents for a living. I know what it looks like when someone is trying to move a piece of property fast and quiet. The withdrawn funding, the public humiliation, the sudden urgent talk of selling, the story about Grandpa being confused. It all pointed one direction. My mother was setting up to get that house signed over before anyone thought to stop her. And the empty box was part of it, a way to break me down and remind me I had no standing to object. She had miscalculated one thing. My grandfather had just handed me a reason to stand. That night, after the last guest left and Marcus was stacking folding chairs, I made a decision at the head table with the wooden box still open in front of me. Not revenge. A visit. I decided that in the morning, before I did anything else, before the honeymoon, before I even changed out of my regular clothes, I was going to drive out to the orchard and sit down with my grandfather and ask him one plain question. What do you actually want? The morning after my wedding, Marcus and I drove the 30 minutes out with 2 coffees and no idea what we were walking into. My grandfather was on the porch when we pulled up, dressed and sharp-eyed, waiting like he'd known I'd come. He was not confused. Let me say that plainly, because my mother had said it so many times I half expected to find a frail man lost in his own kitchen. Instead I found Elias Voss doing the crossword in pen. He poured us coffee in the mugs my grandmother made runs to the hardware store to buy. He had Marcus sit in the chair that used to be his own son's, looked at him for a long moment, and said he had good hands. I watched my husband's ears go red. Then he told me to sit down. Because there were things I should have been told years ago and wasn't. And he was done letting my mother decide what I got to know. He started at the beginning. He told me he married my grandmother in 1963 against her own family's wishes, because they said a lineman was beneath a girl like her. He said her mother had cried at the wedding, and not the good kind of crying. He said her family gave her a set of everyday dishes as a wedding gift, the cheap kind, to make a point about the life they thought she was choosing. He smiled when he said it. 60 years I ate off those dishes, he said. And every meal was better than anything on their china. He reached across the table and put his worn hand over mine, the one now wearing my grandmother's ring, and said, "You married a good man, Ellie. I know exactly what your mother made you feel last night." I felt it in 1963. Now let me tell you the rest. Here is the rest. The thing my mother had spent 30 years painting over. There is no old family money. There never was. The standing my mother is so proud of, the name, the reputation she'd sell her own daughter to protect. All of it came from Elias Voss's 2 hands. He started as an apprentice lineman at 18. He worked ice-cold storms and burned summers on hot substation lines. He saved, and eventually he started his own electrical contracting company with 1 truck and his own name on the door. It grew. By the time my mother was a teenager, Elias employed 30 men and had a real business. The kind that put a girl through college without loans. He paid for every bit of the life my mother now pretends she was born into. And my mother, Diane, grew up as the lineman's daughter in a town that never let her forget it. Kids at school called her that, sneering, the lineman's daughter. She hated it. She hated the truck in the driveway, the coveralls in the wash, the way her father's hands never quite came clean. So the minute she had the means, she reinvented the whole thing. She married a man with a soft office job and a family name that sounded like money. She moved to the right neighborhood, and she buried her own father under a story about old family so thoroughly that her own children never learned the truth. My grandfather said it without bitterness. Just fact. Your mother is ashamed of the man who paid for everything she has. I sat there with the pin in my palm. The empire my mother lorded over the whole reception hall, the standing that made my marriage a bad investment, had been built by a lineman. By the very kind of man she just humiliated me for loving. And she knew it. That was why she'd gone white. My grandfather got up then, slower than he used to, and came back with a shoebox of photographs my mother didn't know still existed. He spread them on the kitchen table. I want to be fair to my mother here because my grandfather was. In one photo, my mom is about 12, standing at the edge of a school dance in a homemade dress. You can see it in her face, even in black and white. The shame. The way she's holding her arms like she wants to disappear. Grandpa touched that photo, and his voice softened. He told me the other girls had worn store-bought dresses and had let my mother know all night that hers wasn't. He told me Elias heard about it, and that he picked up extra weekend shifts for 2 months, up on poles in the cold, so he could buy his girl one dress from the good store downtown, the kind the other girls wore. My mother wore it once. Then she stopped going to dances. Something in her decided at 12 that she would never be the poor girl again, that she would climb so high nobody could ever look down at her. And she climbed right over her own father to do it. I looked at that frightened 12-year-old in the photograph, and I felt something I did not want to feel for the woman who'd handed me an empty box. I felt sorry for her. My grandfather watched me feel it, and then he said the thing that kept it from softening me into weakness. Being hurt like that explains her, Ellie. It does not excuse selling this house out from under me, and it does not give her the right to set a price on you. Understanding a person and obeying them are two different things. Then my grandfather reached to the sideboard and handed me a folder, and my claims examiner brain went cold and clear the second I opened it. Inside was a quitclaim deed. It was already filled out professionally, transferring the orchard house from my grandfather's name into my mother's. All it needed was Elia's signature. My mother had brought it out the week before, my grandfather said, along with a lot of talk about how the house was too much to keep up. How he might fall out here alone. How it would be simpler if Diane just handled things. She'd left the deed on the table like a bill you're expected to pay. And she told my grandfather a notary would be coming by that Monday to make it official. 2 days away. I asked my grandfather gently, because I had to, whether he wanted to sign it. Whether maybe the house was too much. He looked at me like I'd asked if he wanted to sign away his own hands. This is the house I built for your grandmother, he said. I grafted those apple trees with you. I am not confused, and I am not tired of my own life. Diane wants it sold so she can erase the last thing in this world with my fingerprints on it. And I have been too scared and too polite to stop her. His chin trembled just once, then it stopped. I don't want her to have it, Ellie, but I don't want it to be a weapon either. I've had enough of this family measuring things. I just want it safe. I sat there with a notary coming Monday, and my grandfather's whole heart on the table. I realized the thing I was good at, the boring, careful thing nobody ever praised, might be the only thing that could actually help. So I asked him the plain question I'd driven out there to ask. Not what my mother wanted. Not what would be simplest. What did he, Elias, actually want to happen to this house? He thought about it for a long time, turning his coffee mug in his hands, and when he answered, he was very clear. He did not want to give it to me. He said that first. And he said it looking right at me because he knew me. If I hand it to you outright, Ellie, your mother will say I was confused and you took advantage and you'll spend the rest of your life defending yourself. And worse, it'll become a thing that gets measured. I'm done with measuring. What he wanted was for the house to stop being something anyone could sell or fight over or use as a weapon. He wanted it put into a trust that couldn't be broken, so that he could live in it for the rest of his days. And after him it would stay in the family as a place, not a price. A place where any Voss who married for love instead of standing would always have somewhere to go. He wanted his own name on it. The real one. The lineman's name. The union man's name. They said I was worth nothing. He said again, quiet, looking at the pin in my hand. Let this house say otherwise for 100 years. I told him I could help him do that the right way. With a real estate attorney and a doctor to document that he was of sound mind, so no one could ever claim he was confused. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then let's beat Monday, he said. And for the first time in the whole terrible weekend, I laughed. That night my mother called, and her voice was different. Soft, almost warm. I hadn't heard that voice pointed at me in years, and, God help me, some old, hungry part of me sat up like a dog at the door. She said she thought we both said things. She said maybe the box was too much, which was as close to an apology as Diane Voss has ever come. And then gently, she made her offer. If I would let the house situation resolve quietly, meaning let her sell it. And if I would keep all that old union nonsense to myself and not go stirring up the family with stories about Grandpa, then she would put me back in her will. She would fund a real honeymoon. She would, she said, welcome me back into this family where I belong. She said she was proud of me. Do you understand what she offered me? Everything. The exact thing I had been auditioning for since I was 5 years old. My mother's approval handed over the phone in a warm voice. My name back in the book. My seat at the table restored. All I had to do was stay quiet and let her sell my grandfather's house and go on pretending he was nobody. For one long moment, standing in my kitchen the day after my wedding, I wanted it so badly I couldn't breathe. That is the honest truth. The little girl who bought birthday gifts and signed 2 names wanted to say yes so fast. I told my mother I needed to think. She said, of course, sweetheart. Take your time. And the word sweetheart went into me like a hook. I hung up and sat down on the kitchen floor. Because the thing I wanted most in the world and the thing I could not live with had just turned out to be the same thing. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table most of the night with my grandmother's ring on my finger and my grandfather's pin in front of me. I did the hardest arithmetic of my life, not with a calculator. My mother taught me to add people up, and I was finally trying to unlearn it. Here is what I saw. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the empty box hadn't hurt because it was cruel. Cruelty I could have taken. It hurt because a part of me believed it. Because somewhere deep down I had accepted my mother's math a long time ago. That I was worth what I could prove. That love was a thing you earned by being useful. And that if I ever stopped performing, I'd be exactly what she said. An empty box. I had been keeping score my whole life on her scoreboard. And her offer, the will, the honeymoon, the sweetheart, was just her handing me the same scoreboard back and asking me to play. If I said yes, I'd win the game and lose the only thing worth having, which was the right to stop playing it. Marcus found me at the table when the sky was going gray. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat down next to me and put his rough hand over my grandmother's ring and waited. And I knew I was going to help my grandfather put that house beyond anyone's reach on Friday, before Monday's notary ever showed up. And then I was going to give my mother her answer. Not on the phone, not quietly, but at the family brunch that weekend, in front of the same people who'd watched me open an empty box. Not to humiliate her. I was done with that scoreboard. Just to finally stop paying a bill that was never real. Friday morning, I took the day off, put on my good blazer, and drove my grandfather to the office of a real estate attorney I trusted from the courthouse. A careful woman named Sandra Kellerman, who does not cut corners. I want to be clear about how ordinary this was because there was no magic in it, no secret document that made anyone rich. We did it the slow, boring, correct way. The way I do everything. The way nobody ever thanks you for. My grandfather met with Sandra alone first, so no one could ever say I was in the room steering him. A physician he'd seen for 15 years came by that same morning and documented in writing that, Elias Voss was of sound mind and knew exactly what he was doing. Then, of his own free will, my grandfather placed the orchard house into an irrevocable trust. He kept the right to live there for the rest of his life. After him, it would pass into the family as a protected place that could never be sold. And the trust named it in plain letters on the first page, the Elias Voss House. When he signed, his hand didn't shake at all. Mine did. Sandra notarized it, filed it, and it was done. Real and legal and permanent. 2 days before my mother's Monday notary was ever going to arrive. On the drive home, my grandfather rolled down the window and let the wind mess up his hair like a teenager. 60 years, he said, watching the orchard rows go by. She'd have liked knowing it can't be sold. Then he looked at me. You did that with the thing they never respected about you. All that carefulness. Look what it saved. I hadn't thought of it that way. I have thought of it that way every day since. The family brunch was that Sunday at my mother's house, on the Good China. Diane hosts a brunch the way she does everything, as a performance of a life she wants you to believe she was born into. The long table, the fresh flowers, the linen napkins folded into shapes. She had, I could tell the moment I walked in, prepared a scene of her own. She thought I was coming to say yes. She told people I was coming to say yes. I could see it in the way she'd seated everyone, in the extra warmth she aimed at Marcus for the first time ever, in the way she'd left the chair at her right hand open for me. The golden seat. The one I'd wanted my whole life. She thought this was the morning her useful daughter came home and took the deal. And she'd built a whole stage to receive me graciously in front of the family. Theo was there, and my aunts, and the cousins who laughed, and Nina, who had barely spoken to her grandmother since the wedding, and who came and sat down beside me instead. Close the way I used to sit close to Elias. I set my grandfather's little wooden box on the table beside my plate. Not hidden this time. Right out where the light could catch it. My mother saw it, and her smile flickered just for a second, and then she smoothed it back and clinked her glass with her ring and stood up to welcome me home. I let her get all the way through the warm opening. The "we're so glad you've come to your senses." The reaching for my hand. I let her build the whole stage, and then I stood up on my own 2 feet at my mother's table. And I said, "Thank you." My mother beamed. Because, "Thank you," was the beginning of the speech she'd written for me in her head. She thought I was about to accept. She actually reached for her glass to toast. So she made her offer real, out loud, in front of everyone, thinking she was sealing it. She announced to the whole table that she and I had worked things out, that I was back in the family, back in her will, that she'd be helping Marcus and me get properly settled. She said it generously, like a queen restoring a banished daughter. She looked around to collect the warm murmurs, and she got them. My aunts nodded. Theo smiled with relief. Everyone waited for me to sit back down in the golden chair and be grateful, and let the family close back up over the whole ugly week like water over a stone. I could feel the pull of it in my own body. Say yes. Sit down. Be enough at last. Take the seat you bled for. I stood there in the pull of it with my grandmother's ring on my finger and Nina's shoulder against my arm and my husband's steady eyes on me from across the table. I understood exactly what I was being offered and exactly what it cost. She was offering me everything I'd ever wanted, in exchange for the one thing I'd just learned I couldn't sell. My mother lifted her glass toward me, waiting, glowing, sure. And I did not lift mine. I stood there calm as still water, in a way that I promise you cost me more than any scene ever could. I said, "Mom, I need to say something first, and I need you to hear all of it before you toast." I did not raise my voice. I want you to know that everything I'd learned about her told me the loudest thing I could do in that room was stay quiet. Because my mother had spent her whole life afraid of exactly one thing, and it wasn't anger. It was the truth said plainly, without shame. So I said it plainly. I opened the little wooden box and took out the thin gold ring and told them it was Grandma's. 60 years of it. Then I took out the brass pin and pinned it to my blazer where everyone could see, and told them whose it was. I told them about Elias Voss, not as a weapon. As an introduction. because most of the people at that table had never really been told. I told them he was a lineman, a union man, that he built his own company with his own hands, and that every good thing any of us had, this house, this china, the college degrees, the standing, all of it came from a lineman who got up before dawn and came home with his hands full of other people's power outages. I said my grandfather's name out loud at my mother's table, the name she'd spent 30 years erasing, and I watched her go white all over again. The same white as the wedding. Then I told them the rest, gently, without a drop of triumph. I told them Grandpa had decided of his own free will, with his own lawyer and his own doctor, to put the orchard house into a trust in his name so it could never be sold. So it would always be a home for anyone in this family who chose love over standing. And Grandpa had asked me to help him do it. So I did. On Friday, my mother rose halfway out of her chair, her hand flat on the table, her mouth open, and for a second I saw the whole thing break across her face at once. The shame and the fury and the 12-year-old in the homemade dress. All of it into that silence. I gave her my answer to her offer. "Thank you for the offer, Mom," I said. "The will, the honeymoon, all of it, truly. But I'm not going to keep quiet, and I'm not going to help you sell his house. So I don't think you'll want to give me any of it. And that's all right." My mother's face hardened into something I recognized. The winter came back into her eyes. She said the thing she thought would end me. She said if that was my choice, then I was out of the will for good. Out permanently, and I would get nothing from this family, not $1 ever. She said it like she was closing a vault. She waited for me to flinch. She'd handed me an empty box once already and watched me not cry. And I think she needed badly to finally see it land, and here's the part I didn't plan and will never forget. I looked at my mother, and then I looked at Marcus, whose lights were still on across that table, and at my grandmother's ring on my finger, and at Nina, watching me the way I once watched Elias, learning in real time that you're allowed to stand up. I told my mother the truest thing I have ever said out loud. "You can keep the money. My worth was never yours to set." The room was so quiet I could hear the clock in the hall. My mother had spent 32 years holding the only pen that could write my price, and I had just calmly, in front of everyone, taken it out of her hand and set it down. I lost the inheritance in that moment. I lost the golden chair. I lost the last thin thread of a mother's approval I'd been chasing since before I could read. I felt every bit of it go. And underneath the losing, steady as Marcus's hand, I felt myself come free. I didn't storm out. There was nothing left to perform. I told my mother I loved her, which was and is true, and made it worse for her, not better. Then I picked up the little wooden box and my husband picked up our coats, and we left. Nina caught me at the door. She tugged my sleeve and pointed at the brass pin on my blazer and asked, in that clear 8-year-old voice that carries across a silent room, "What's that, Aunt Ellie?" I knelt down so we were eye to eye. I told her it belonged to her great-grandfather, and that he built the power lines that light up whole towns, and that he was one of the best men who ever lived, and that anyone who told her different didn't know what a person was worth. She nodded very seriously, filing it away, and asked if she could see the orchard house someday. I told her it would always be there, that it could never be sold now, that it was hers to visit for the rest of her life. Behind me, I heard my mother sit down slowly at the head of her beautiful table. And Theo, my brother, who has laughed half a second behind our mother his entire life, did not laugh. He stood in the doorway of the dining room with his napkin still in his hand, looking at me and then at the pin and then at his own daughter. And something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there before. Doubt. The first real doubt. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I drove home with my husband and my grandmother's ring and my grandfather's pin. Poorer than I'd been that morning by every measure my mother knew, and richer than I'd ever been in my life by the only one that turned out to be real. It's been 6 months. I'll tell you the truth because this isn't a fairy tale, and you deserve the real ending. My mother did take me out of the will, and she meant it. We don't speak much. She still tells people we come from old family. Still hosts her brunches. Still opens the calculator when she's upset. The thing that hurt her never got healed,
and a hurt like that doesn't vanish because her daughter grew a spine.
I didn't fix my mother. You can't. But the orchard house stands, and it will keep standing with Elias's name on the deed where anyone can read it.
My grandfather lives there still.
Every Saturday, Marcus and I drive the 30 minutes out, and he fixes whatever's loose, and I do the crossword with Grandpa in pen.
We hung the photograph back up in his hallway, the one my mother made disappear. The man in work clothes, grinning next to his coil of cable. One boot on a transformer box. Theo started calling me every now and then. Careful, like a man testing ice, but calling. And Nina asked her mother last month why nobody ever talks about the great-grandfather who could fix anything.
I heard Theo's wife didn't have a good answer, and that she didn't like not having one.
That's how it breaks, I think.
Not all at once. Not in one loud scene at a wedding.
It breaks the way my grandfather's stairs never did, one careful joint at a time.
In the next generation,
in an 8-year-old who now knows exactly what a lineman was worth. It took an empty box to teach me the one thing my family never could. Nobody gets to set the price of what you're worth. Not your mother, not your family, not the whole laughing room. Nobody. Unless you're the one who hands them the pen. I think about that reception hall sometimes. The string lights Marcus wired with his own hands. The 2 boxes side by side on that head table. One glossy and white and empty, built to hollow me out in front of everyone I loved. One brown paper and string, 60 years old, built by a man the world called nothing, to remind one woman what she was actually made of. I used to think love was something you earned with a spreadsheet of good behavior. Casseroles at the right funerals. Birthday gifts signed with 2 names. Answering a phone at 2 a.m. and never asking why it was always me.
I know better now.
Real love doesn't keep a ledger. It doesn't check your usefulness at the door. It sees you empty-handed in a half-buttoned dress with your heart pounding, and it says, quietly, "You're already enough." My grandfather taught me that with a pin he carried for 60 years and never once needed to explain to anyone who mattered. My husband taught me that with a string of lights he wired himself so I'd never have to wonder if the room would stay lit, and I am still slowly teaching myself that lesson every single day. Because 30 years of a different kind of math doesn't erase itself in one brunch. However good the ending felt, some mornings I still catch myself doing the old arithmetic without meaning to. Totaling up what I did that day, whether it was enough, whether I earned my seat somewhere. And then I look down at my hand, at a ring worn thin from 60 years of honest work, and I remember. Nobody hands you your worth in a box. Not an empty one, not a full one. You already walked in carrying it. The only question is whether you let someone convince you otherwise. That's my story. An empty box, a rusted union pin, and a house that will never be for sale. If someone ever tried to measure your worth in dollars, and some quiet, stubborn part of you refused to hand them the pen, take that as your sign today. Go call the person who saw you clearly. Tell them what it meant. Some debts are worth paying. And that one always was. And if you've ever sat in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, holding something that turned out to be empty, I want you to hear this clearly. Because I needed someone to say it to me, and nobody did until an 86-year-old man in a good gray suit finally did. You were never the empty box. You were never the thing being measured. You were the one who got to decide, all along, whose hands were allowed to hold the pen that wrote your price. And the day you take that pen back is the day you finally stop auditioning for your own life. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the thing in your life nobody ever thanked you for that turned out to be the thing that saved everyone? I read every single one. Subscribe to Calm Drama Vault, and I'll see you in the next one.